Hello, I'm Marguerite Gong Hancock, Vice President of Innovation here at CHM. On behalf of the museum, welcome. Today's program, entitled If Then, Democracy at the Crossroads, features award-winning historian Jill Lepore in conversation with CHM Senior Curator Dag Spicer. Thanks to the generosity of our members and donors, we're so pleased to offer these public education programs. We invite every one of you to be part of our community. We need you more than ever to help sustain and build a museum to decode technology for everyone to shape a better future. So please join and give to CHM. With just 13 days until the 2020 US election, we're continuing our programming focus on technology and the election. Commentators accuse the Trump campaign of using a new computer-driven big data voter manipulation machine. New? Hardly. Jill Lepore, in her latest book, tells a story of how a long-forgotten company named Simulmatics invented that machine in 1959. In fact, in the 1960 election, the media reported that John F. Kennedy clinched the presidential victory with the help of a secret weapon, a supercomputer that crunched troves of data to profile and target political messaging to sway voters. Simulmatics, the company behind that story, and its people machine helped lay the early foundation for the field of predictive analytics. Today, these tools feel ubiquitous, wielded by internet platforms, advertisers, and political strategists to help sell consumer products, or sometimes election candidates. Who were the visionaries and brains behind Simulmatics? How did the company pioneer the development and application of computing and big data to predict behavior and win hearts and minds? How successful were those early efforts from their election voting booth to Saigon? And what can we learn from Simulmatics as a cautionary tale for the perils and promise of predictive analytics and their impact on democracy and our lives today? To explore these questions and more, we're thrilled to feature Jill Lepore in conversation with Dag Spicer. It's now my pleasure to introduce both speakers. Jill Lepore is the David Woods Kemper 41 Professor of American History and Affiliate Professor of Law at Harvard University. She's also a staff writer at The New Yorker and host of the podcast, The Last Archive. Jill's been contributing to The New Yorker magazine since 2005, writing about American history, law, literature, and politics. She's a recipient of many honors, awards, and honorary degrees, and she's been finalist for the National Book Award, the National Magazine Award, and twice for the Pulitzer Prize. Her many books include These Truths, A History of the United States, published in 2018, named one of Time Magazine's top 10 nonfiction books of the decade. Her most recent book, If Then, How the Simulmatics Corporation Invented the Future, is the basis for today's conversation. It's been longlisted for the National Book Award and shortlisted for the Financial Times Mackenzie Book Award. Welcome, Jill. Dag Spicer, our moderator today, is CHM Senior Curator. One of the museum's earliest staff members, Dag's been key to the development of the museum as he leads the museum's strategic direction relating to its collection of computer artifacts, film, documents, software, and ephemera, the largest collection of computers and related materials in the world. A brief note as we begin, today's conversation will not be followed by Q&A, but we do encourage you viewers to share your comments throughout the program via the Zoom Q&A feature. Jill and Dag, we look forward to your conversation.
Well, thank you, Jill, again for being with us today. And we're here, of course, to speak about your wonderful new book, If Then, How the Simulmatics Corporation Invented the Future. And can you tell us a little bit about that and the role of history in understanding where we are today, how Simulmatics kind of foreshadows a bit of the environment in which we find ourselves today?
Sure, absolutely. And first to say it's great to be with you. I wish I were out there in the Computer History Museum, sitting down, taking some time wandering the great exhibit halls there, and maybe enjoying a bit of your weather. But it's great to be with you in this way as well. So the Simulmatics Corporation was a pioneering data science company founded in New York in 1959. It went bankrupt in 1970, so it didn't have a very long life. But it left a long shadow, it cast a long shadow. The company went public in 1961, and so it was a kind of creaky dinosaur-like version of the sort of dynamism of Silicon Valley that we are more familiar with today. One of the reasons I wrote the book is that, I think as you know very well, it's a lot of the myth and self-mystification of Silicon Valley involves kind of denying that there is a history to much that is going on. so much of the culture of the startup culture, the venture capital culture of disruptive innovation is we've blown up the existing industry and invented something completely new, and we're disrupting everything with our massive innovation. So it kind of goes against the grain to pause and think about, well, actually, maybe this isn't particularly original. I stumbled across a story of this company a number of years ago, and it answered for me so many questions I had about where certain kinds of ideas and practices came from. And it turns out that so much of what we think of as disruptively innovative about, say, social media companies like Facebook or Twitter really comes out of Cold War psychological warfare. And that's the story I tell in my book, IFTHEN.
Right. And in fact, I believe in the IPO, the company, if I can just read it, it says, the company proposes to engage principally in estimating probable human behavior by use of computer technology. So can you tell us a bit about some of the, let's start at the beginning and just think about the formation of the company and the people involved, Ed Greenfield, Ethel de Sola-Pool, and tell us a bit about these colorful people, because they were quite interesting characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a bit of an Ocean's 11 in which Ed Greenfield is the Danny Ocean. People have seen the heist films, the Ocean's 11 movies. So Ed Greenfield was a Madison Avenue ad man. He ran his own ad agency, the Edward L. Greenfield Company. And he did, advertising for retailers, but he also did political consulting, which in a way was unusual because at the time in the 1950s, Republicans were the party that took advantage of advertising agencies for providing support for campaigns. If you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, right? The Republican Party then was the party of business. Democrats were the party of labor. Big ad agencies had a lot of big businesses as their clients. Those big businesses were Republican owned, and it was sort of a natural extension of providing services to Republican-owned businesses to begin to provide services to Republican political campaigns. And in fact, in the 1950s, Democrats, the party was led by Adlai Stevenson, the governor of Illinois, who ran for president against Eisenhower both in 1952 and 1956. Democrats were really opposed to the role that advertising agencies played in American politics. Stevenson spoke out against it, accused the Eisenhower campaign of running a cornflakes campaign in which you were choosing your president the way you might choose, what kind of cereal you wanted, what kind of breakfast cereal you wanted. And also Democrats had a hard time retaining ad agencies to run campaigns for them because there weren't very many ad agencies that were Democratic, where the owners were Democrats. But Greenfield was a liberal. He was a very active advocate of civil rights, and in that way was considerably to the left of much of the Democratic Party in the 1950s, was really split over the question of civil rights, had literally splintered into the Dixiecrats and the Democrats earlier. And he became fascinated by, I'm pretty sure he became fascinated by the possibility of using computers to help provide political campaigns with campaign advice in 1952. So as visitors to the museum will know, the UNIVAC was the first kind of commercially available general purpose computer. One was built by Remington Rand for the U.S. Census Bureau to count the census, the 1950 census. And then in 1952, CBS hired Remington Rand's UNIVAC to project the election results on election night in this big kind of PR stunt that was a kind of twofer, right? It was going to be both good for CBS News. It was hopefully going to make watching election night more interesting. And it was going to be good for Remington Rand because they could get people excited about computers. So election night 1952 was really, it's Walter Cronkite, Charles Collingwood, Edward R. Murrow. It's really the very first time that most Americans had ever seen a computer. It's a kind of a great story. CBS called it Project X. It was like this top secret project. But it was a really interesting experiment. And when you think about it, if you were interested in using data about people to do predictions of human behavior, elections would be the way that you would do that. You'd begin to work with election data, because democracies generate their own data set, right? Like we have returns. And in the US, since we have a census, we have population information that's quite reliable. There was also a tremendous amount of public opinion polling done in the 1950s. So Greenfield kind of got this idea that if he could bring together this team of the right people, the kind of the best and the brightest, he would be able to provide to Democratic candidates computer-aided consultation about campaign issues.
Okay, so this notion of using computers to predict things, do you feel that it was the 1952 election, the UNIVAC election, if you like, that spurred Greenfield and others to consider the use of computers in social science research?
Yeah, I mean, people knew about these giant like in the popular press, there was coverage of these giant electronic brains with reference to the military uses, right? So, the SAGE system that Lincoln Lab is working on at the time, or the Whirlwind at MIT. But they're all of these defense projects, right? So it was not clear to anybody what the other applications, well, to very few people, what other applications aside from flight simulation. So the simulation of flight is where the kind of idea of computer simulation enters popular discourse. You see it in newspapers all the time in the 1950s. People are kind of fascinated that you could train pilots by doing a simulation of a flight instead of actually having to have the flight. Or for missile defense, increasingly, so it makes sense that you could predict the movement of objects through space, right? There are laws of gravity that would obtain there. It's kind of a new idea that you could predict human behavior using the calculations that a computer is able to do and the programming that you can use to instruct a computer to do something. And that really only becomes apparent during that 1952 election.
Do you feel that there's, at this time, kind of a fulcrum where you mentioned that the people behind Simulmatics were, I think you called them mid-century white liberals who viewed intelligence and logic as a solution to the world's problems? And you had a wonderful paragraph later on about Simulmatics in Vietnam, where these, the new people doing surveys come in every year full of fresh ideas that they're going to improve the situation, and then they leave with kind of in a situation of dismay. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that and the desire to do good in the world as part of their motivation. Well,
most of this stuff, frankly, doesn't work. I mean, I think very little of it works today, honestly. I think it's a lot of snake oil. There are things that it does there are things that some of these technologies do that are the unintended consequences of things that it fails to do. But I think with the case of Simulmatics and its promise that it could use computer technology to predict human behavior, for the most part, it's unsuccessful. But it's incredibly exciting to think about, and Greenfield was a tremendously effective salesman. So from our vantage, though, a lot of what Simulmatics offered as advice really pretty closely falls into the bin that we would label common sense. And so what's puzzling then is, why would people buy this? It has, a little bit of a kind of emperor's new clothes to it. But I guess it still does, is what's kind of puzzling to me as a historian. So for instance, I want to kind of talk a little bit more about the election work that Simulmatics did before getting to Vietnam, because it's a very different project. So when Greenfield put together his team of people who were political scientists and mathematical sociologists, his computer guy was a guy named Alex Bernstein, who was the first guy to program a computer to play chess. He worked for IBM. He'd worked for the Signal Corps during the Korean War. He worked for IBM where he devised this. Bernstein was at the famous 1956 Dartmouth Summer Seminar on Artificial Intelligence with Marvin Minsky and Claude Shannon. And he was kind of the best guy that Greenfield could recruit. He was a New Yorker. And so he pulls together all these people to work on this program, which his PR guy calls the people machine, which is to come up with a simulation of the electorate and then simulate the process of voting. So it's essentially a voting behavior machine. And by now they're not using a UNIVAC, they're using an IBM 704, which they're programming in Fortran. So it's, it seems very exciting and sexy and cutting edge, and they're all extremely well qualified. Greenfield put together really some of the most exciting thinkers in the social sciences, young guys. But it's important to think about what it is that he was building this. So computers at the time were called question answer machines, right? You could ask a question, you'd get an answer. And it's kind of interesting to wonder what is the big question that Greenfield and his team were building this people machine to answer. It's a little bit like the, Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. What is the answer to life, the universe, and everything? Well, if the answer is 42, like how useful is that? Like what was the question they were trying to ask? And what the question they were trying to ask was, if you cared about black voters, would you change your political message? And if you changed your political message and earned the votes of black voters, could you defeat Eisenhower's successor, who everyone knew would be Richard Nixon, his vice president? So in effect, what Greenfield's entire project was designed to do was convince the Democratic Party that black voters mattered. And we could say from our vantage, was that really such a hard sell? Like, why was it so hard to convince the Democratic Party that black voters mattered? So think about 1960, the year of this election, when after Greenfield and his team of people build this so-called people machine, they sell their services first to the Democratic National Committee and then to the Democratic nominee, who's John F. Kennedy. This is a year when the sit-ins are taking place all across the South. It started in Greensboro, North Carolina. When you turn on your television at night and you are seeing civil rights activists, young people, college students being beaten up by the police and dragged out of restaurants, it's not actually a mystery that that black voters matter, and that civil rights is an urgent issue confronting the nation. It wouldn't have taken a lot for a team of good advisors, presumably, if Kennedy had included among his world of close advisors African-American leaders and civil rights leaders, to convince Kennedy to take a stronger position on civil rights and the Democratic Party to do so. From our vantage, that looks like a common sense adjustment of Kennedy's political position. I think it was very difficult, in fact, for Kennedy to take that position. And in many ways, it kind of required this crazy razzle-dazzle of, what is essentially like a dog and pony show with, punch cards and electricity to convince the Democratic Party to change its position. And that's a thing that I think is very much with us still. Among the deeper critiques of the culture of Silicon Valley has to do with the way in which you see a lot of people kind of trying to puzzle out how people who are different from them might think and then try to control their behavior. So there's an element to that of the founding of the Simulmatics Corporation itself that is a very well-intentioned ambition, but it also means believing somehow that it requires this new higher standard of evidence to think about people of color and women and their ideas and their opinions. And so you see, like if you kind of zoom out from what Simulmatics is doing throughout the 1960s, it's a bunch of sort of mystified and befuddled white liberal men trying to figure out how people of color think and what women want. I mean, in its kind of grossest historical vantage, that's actually what these machines are being built for. That is what the ambition of artificial intelligence at some level is early on, right? So it has a very, to me, chilling vibe about the presumptions of mid-century liberalism and the long-term consequences of mystifying the minds of people who are different from you.
Right, and I think at least in the Kennedy campaign's case, and maybe later on, as you suggested, gave people cover to take on positions. It gave this sort of a penumbra of rationality to decisions that, like you say, were kind of common sense, but were rendered more forceful by the fact that it had been run through the computer, so to speak. Can you tell us a bit about the other co-founder, IFTHEN de Solipool?
Yeah, so Greenfield's, the main members of his team were people that he worked with in 1956 when he ran Adlai Stevenson's campaign in California to try to win the Democratic primary in that state. And so the operation really has kind of Silicon Valley area origins. Ithiel de Soulpool is a political scientist who worked at the Hoover Institute at the time, a quantitative political scientist who'd done psychological warfare stuff with the great sort of propagandist Harold Lasswell during the Second World War. Lasswell went on to be a major stockholder in Simulmatics and a major booster of the company. So Poole was at the Hoover Institute studying what we might think of as, Poole is the guy who kind of comes up with the term social networks. He's the guy behind 6 Degrees of Separation. He's a kind of network theorist. He's interested in social networks, and he's also interested in the latest ways of using computers to examine language and therefore predict behavior through content analysis, which is kind of a new method and is very much an ancestor to kind of Google trend spotting, say. So Poole worked at the Hoover Institute trying to figure out ways to predict communist revolutions around the world by looking for words in newspapers, doing this largely by hand. Kind of, you think of topic spotting, right, and pattern detection and content analysis of newspaper stories to see, like, where is communism gaining a hold here? That's the kind of work that he was doing. But he's also a Democrat with political sympathies aligned with Greenfield, very much a supporter of Adlai Stevenson, and so he did some voting behavior research for the Stevenson campaign in California in 1956. And he worked then with a political theorist from University of California, Berkeley, Eugene Burdick, who did interviews of what we would call thought leaders in California at Stevenson in 1956. Burdick was at the Center for the Advanced Study of the Behavioral Sciences, which had just been founded in Palo Alto. And he was really interested in the quantification of the field of political science. He was really interested in how political scientists were beginning to use computers to think about voters and voting behavior. And he wrote 2 dystopian novels about that work. The first was published in 1956. It's called The Ninth Wave. And it's about a very creepy political consultant who uses data that he collects on punch cards to provide election analysis to a demagogue that he wants to get elected governor of California. So Greenfield had worked with both of these guys very carefully in 1956, and he wanted both of them to join the Simulmatics Corporation when he formed it in 1959. But the other really major player in the company was a guy named Bill McPhee, who had trained at the Bureau of Social Science Research at Columbia. And he's the guy who really wrote the code for the election, for the simulation of an election. He suffered from manic depression. He's an extraordinarily complicated figure. During the time he was working on this project for Greenfield, his wife had him committed to Bellevue. He'd become violent. So some of the original work for this voting behavior machine was done from an insane asylum. So those are kind of the core people on the team, including then Alex Bernstein, the guy from IBM. Burdick refuses to be involved in the Simulmatics Corporation. He isn't really prepared to. He's not a quantitative political scientist. He's a political theorist. But he has also come to believe that it undermines American democracy. And he goes on to write another dystopian novel specifically about the Simulmatics Corporation that is published in 1964. It's called The 480. And then he dies very young in 1965. But he's a really key figure in this story as well.
Now, you mentioned that the archival trail left behind by some of the election consultants that were involved, not just in Simulmatics, but in general, I guess. You call them Flimflam Men, which is a great turn of phrase. Can you tell us a bit what you found in those archives?
Yeah, so just to kind of continue the story out, because the reason that the archives don't exist is because of the way the company fell apart. So after providing campaign advice for the Kennedy campaign in 1960, after Kennedy wins, Simulmatics takes credit and then goes public the following spring. And Greenfield is able to pull together a whole lot of contracts for a bunch of work in different realms. The company does a big election night project for the New York Times in 1962. They provide kind of brand switching advice to companies like Colgate-Palmolive or Ralston Purina. And then in 1965, the company opens an office in Saigon and does years worth of work for the Department of Defense. In 1968, the company has a big contract from the Kerner Commission on civil disorders, a national commission formed by Lyndon Johnson to investigate race riots and racial protest in the United States. They're trying to do something that we would think of as predictive policing. In fact, it is called that at the time. And then anti-war protests at MIT, where Ithiel de Solopoul, who had been at the Hoover Institute in Stanford, he has moved to MIT and is the chairman of the political science department. By 1969, students at MIT are protesting Poole and protesting Simulmatics for the work it has done in Vietnam. And those protests and a series of other developments lead to the company going bankrupt quite suddenly in 1970, at which point Ed Greenfield is essentially no longer functioning because, in part, of the tragic death of his wife, which is another complicated story, but for which he blames himself, and he's kind of descended into drink. But the company had offices in New York, in Washington briefly, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then in Saigon. Almost all the records ended up in New York, except for those that stayed in Cambridge. And when Greenfield fell apart and fell into dissolution, I think he probably just stopped paying the bill of whatever warehouse or storage facility was holding those records after the company declared bankruptcy. So the official company records just are gone. I mean, I suppose it's possible they will emerge someday, but I very much doubt it. So I had to piece together the story from a variety of other different sources. The chief source were Poole's own papers, which are at MIT. It's 200 boxes, archival boxes of material. Poole was an incredibly prolific political scientist who worked in a number of different fields in important ways, but his work on simulation and with Simulmatics as a kind of the company that he helped form and served as the chairman of the research board for is very well chronicled in those boxes. But then since so many of the other people involved with Simulmatics were academics, they have also deposited their papers places. James Coleman, who worked for the company, his papers at the University of Chicago, for instance. There really aren't a lot of papers related to Greenfield. McPhee, I was able to reconstruct much of McPhee's life because his granddaughter has preserved all of her family's correspondence. And her mother, who's a really important character in the story, Minnow McPhee, Bill McPhee's wife, they were from Colorado. They lived in New York for a long time where she was raising 3 children. She wrote to her mother all the time, several times a week, and her letters are full of detail about all of these people. So I had this vast trove that the McPhee family was really generous to let me work with. So it's a very patchy kind of research. There's also, there are chronicles of Simulmatics work in Vietnam in the National Archives and the records, in the ARPA records, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, later DARPA. Huge files related to the company's work in Vietnam to be found there. So there are a lot of other places. And then I also interviewed a few people who worked for Simulmatics who were very young at the time and who are still around, who were really great to talk to. And then I interviewed the children of most of the scientists because a lot of mid-century companies, Simulmatics was a big kind of family affair. There were a lot of, Simulmatics picnics and summer retreats where wives and children were brought along. So people had a kind of intimate experience of the company's culture in that way.
Right. And at one point, the simulation is called the Abomb of the social sciences. And when I first read that, I wasn't quite sure how to interpret that. I wonder if you could shed a bit of light on what they meant by that, or what you meant by that.
Yeah, it's Harold Lasswell who says that. Harold Lasswell, who's this, he's at Yale at the time, but he's, I'm trying to think of a figure that's even like Lasswell today. I mean, maybe kind of like a Steven Pinker, a sort of big personality, celebrity intellectual, is how I would probably think of Lasswell. He's quoted all the time in the newspaper. He's the kind of go-to guy to talk to about propaganda and psychological warfare. And he calls the Simulmatics Corporation's project for the Kennedy campaign in 1960 the Abomb of the social sciences. And he means by that it's like the Manhattan Project. Poole calls it the Manhattan Project of the social sciences. That he means by that it will change everything. It will change how we know what we know. and what we understand as lying within the realm of possibility within this field of knowledge.
Yeah, so maybe you could tell us a bit about this unusual relationship between Simulmatics and the Pentagon. It seemed to be fraught with anxiety on the Pentagon's part. They even, summary at the very end of the project, I think, said it disgraced not only the company but social sciences in general, which was quite a condemnation. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah. So if you think about the fundamental work that people who are working in this field, both for the Simulmatics Corporation and at universities across the country, people who are using computers to try to predict human behavior, where are you going to get the funding to do that? You're mainly going to get the funding to do that from the military, right? Simulmatics is one of the only places that figures out there could be commercial applications. You could sell this to political candidates. You could sell it to retailers for their advertising campaigns. But most of the stuff is being done for the military. And the chief project in the Cold War is not so much figuring out how to win hearts and minds in the Soviet Union or the Soviet republics, right? There's the Iron Curtain. What are you going to do? Like, you can only do Voice of America broadcasts. You can't really perforate the Iron Curtain, although there are plenty of projects that are attempting to do that. The real battle for trying to predict human behavior for the Cold War will be what would have been called the Third World then, or the developing world, right? So newly independent republics, nation states in Latin America and Africa and Asia that had been part of European empires that have been colonized and are now newly dependent, are essentially, as the American U.S. State Department would see it, are choosing between allying with the Soviet Union or allying with China or allying with the United States. So they're choosing between a capitalist ally and a communist ally. And what American foreign policy was involved in many of these parts in the world was trying to thwart any movement toward communism, right? Which would have been understood in the language of the time as an insurgency, right? Sort of if there is going to be a revolution, like in Cuba, or a communist revolution that would lead to this place becoming allied with the Soviet Union, be a threat to American security, as Americans understood it, right? As the State Department understood it. So the work then of these people who are doing the computer detection of patterns of human behavior was essentially spotting insurgencies, right? Where, if you read the way we now kind of monitor the chatter to look for terrorism, right? There's all kinds of topic spotting and pattern detection that's used to try to find glimpses and hints that of terrorist activity, right? So the counterinsurgency work of the Department of Defense is, let's see where we can see kind of chatter that leads us to believe there's going to be an insurgency. Or maybe there is an insurgency already and now we need to start countering it, right? The question, Poole would always say, and Poole was like the chief social scientist advising the Department of Defense on counterinsurgency, better to predict the insurgency and avert it than try to counter it, right? So a lot of these tools were designed to collect enough data and do kind of content analysis or whatever the other kind of natural language processing we would say now to evaluate those lines of communication, and then send messages into that country that could try to avert the insurgency, right? Like try to convince the population, capitalism is great. You love the USSR, right? I mean, you love the US, not the USSR. So Poole, not as part of Simulmatics, but just as a defense intellectual, is working on a number of these projects, especially in Latin America, which had been Kennedy's priority. One of them is called Project Camelot, which is basically trying to do a systems analysis of Latin American countries in order to control political messages within the country. It is discovered by the Chilean media and then denounced as unbelievably arrogant interference on the part of the United States into the internal affairs of Latin American nations. Johnson has to terminate the program. So after the kind of public scandal of Project Camelot, these counterinsurgency programs kind of go underground. And it becomes difficult at that point to hire academics to do counterinsurgency work because there will be student protest over it, right? Because this is just the kind of thing that the student protest organizations on college campuses in the United States in the 1960s are going to be really upset about, right? Like these counterinsurgency projects in places like Latin America. So when ARP is interested in doing counterinsurgency work in Vietnam, they need to find some very smart people to do that work, and most of those people are at universities, but they can't actually hire academics in that sense. So Simulmatics represents a huge opportunity because it is a for-profit corporation that will basically hide what these academics are doing. It's not like, oh, I just accepted money as a member of the faculty at Harvard from the CIA to do this covert work, or I've just accepted money. Like, it's hidden. It's this company that I'm affiliated with has taken on all that money. So it's one of the reasons why, because you look at the files and ARPA just thinks they're doing a terrible job all the time. Like, why do they keep giving them contracts? It's because they don't have a lot of options. So I'm sorry, I've given you a very long answer, but I think what counterinsurgency is really important because it's not that different from misinformation campaigns that political candidates conduct today, for instance, right? Or that that we suspect Russian bots of conducting, or the Internet Research Agency. Like, if you want to interfere with how people are receiving information so that you can change their political opinions and direct their political activity, I mean, it's just a very old Cold War trick. Like, that's what counterinsurgency work is based on, and that's what Robert McNamara, who's Kennedy's and then Johnson's Secretary of Defense, who had been the CEO of Ford Motor Company, he was a systems analyst. He wanted to run the Vietnam War by computer, and he wanted to run it as a war of counterinsurgency, where the real victory would have to be had in the winning of hearts and minds. All that rhetoric of the winning of hearts and minds comes out of that war. And that's the kind of thing that, in a broad sense, Simulmatics is involved in. So is RAND. I mean, RAND is a much bigger player in Saigon than Simulmatics is, but they're doing the same kind of work.
Right, and I think you mentioned that McNamara knew the sort of killed in action rate, but there was no easy way to measure the hearts and minds aspect of the battle, and for that they turned to RAND and Simulmatics to run in some way, well, a couple of things. It sounds like mostly they did a bunch of surveys, but that the general idea of Project Camelot was if X number of radio broadcasts and Y number of pamphlets, then Z number of defectors. In a way, you mentioned McNamara's computer program, like the Igloo White program, which cost $1 billion a year and was essentially an automated, computerized program to bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so they're very much wanting to control the war remotely. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to us about what Simulmatics actually did on the ground and how successful that was.
Yeah, so what Simulmatics is doing on the ground are chiefly two projects. One is doing their own gathering of data, which is very much by hand and is certainly not involving computers. So pools, graduate students. I should say that most of the Simulmatics scientists refuse to go to Saigon. They're opposed to the war. They leave the company. It really diminishes the company that Greenfield and Poole decide this is an okay thing to do. But Poole is very gung-ho. He's a very determined Cold Warrior. So he and his graduate students are doing a series basically of public opinion surveys. They're going to these pacified hamlets, right? These where Vietnamese farmers have been forced off their land and made to live within these kind of fortified villages where they are supposedly insulated from the influence of communist insurgents, and they're not going to go off and join the North Vietnamese army. So Poole and his graduate students, and mainly his graduate students, will helicopter in or by a military escort truck go into these villages and then sit down and interview villagers. They have these elaborate public opinion questionnaires. They're quite lengthy. They use generally college students as interpreters. None of the Americans on the project speak Vietnamese. Few of them speak French. So I was able to interview a couple of people who had worked at Vietnamese students who had worked for the company as interpreters. So they ask these questions. I mean, they're sort of like, which would make you most happy, a television or a radio? I don't have the questions really are about, like, if you had a TV, what would you watch? Like, multiple choice questions. They're trying to understand, they're trying to come up with essentially a model of the Vietnamese peasant mind, right? Through the same way that, Gallup would do work. Just the conditions don't really apply. Doing public opinion survey research in Vietnamese fortified villages is not the same as knocking on suburban housewives' doors in suburban New Jersey. It's just not. And so the studies keep coming back, and ARPA keeps saying this is nonsense. So that's one project that Simulmatics is involved in. That takes a number of years, and there are add-ons to it. But the other big project is evaluating what was called the Hamlet evaluation system. So one of McNamara's fantasies was that he would have people in these hamlets, the fortified villages, collect data every day about everything that was going on. How many meals were eaten, how many chickens were slaughtered that day, how many times gunfire was heard. People would be collecting data all day long in these hamlets and then sending it back to Saigon to military command, where there was a giant computer where all that information would be entered in to a program that was supposed to be evaluating the security of the hamlets and trying to determine whether there was a threat, a kind of Viet Cong threat in any particular hamlet. And Simulmatics was hired to evaluate the evaluation system and wrote a report that basically said, this system is excellent in every possible way, which is, I think, what Poole kind of thought ARPA wanted. But actually, ARPA was very suspicious. It's kind of interesting. ARPA is very serious about wanting real scientific research to be done, and very troubled by what its own internal reviewers believe to be completely shoddy work. So eventually, they just shut the whole project down in 1968. The whole Simulmatics project. But something about that machine, survives in lore about the war. There's a kind of story about, it's only half apocryphal, about, so McNamara has this giant computer in the basement of the Pentagon, and into that computer, his staff is feeding every possible piece of data about the war and about the people of Vietnam, how many tanks, what the weather is like, how many battleships are offshore, how much Agent Orange, how much napalm, which day, what number of troops, what number of people are killed, what is the body count here, what's the kill ratio there, and that all that information finally, by one day in 1967, is finally entered into this giant electronic brain, which people called computers at the time. And so the guys enter the last information on punch cards at the end of a day on a Friday. The computer whirs and spins all through the weekend, and the guys come in on Monday, this day in 1967, and they type in and they ask the computer, when will we win the war? And the computer says, you won in 1965. Which is, the kind of the great allegory for the incredible arrogance and misunderstanding that running such a war by way of data analysis actually is. And it's that kind of skepticism about what Simulmatics is doing that you see in the internal ARPA documents.
Right, and I'd like to, this idea of fantasy of predicting human behavior with machines is, of course, still with us. And I know that Poole himself was quite prescient, actually, in many of his predictions about the kind of world we would be facing today. And, a couple of the things he mentioned was that we would be, and these are my own words, but, more tribal, and that we perhaps lacked a common cultural base anymore. And I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, and how social media, just to connect the main ideas behind if-then to, say, a Facebook or a normal or a current day social media company.
Yep. I mean, there are a lot of important ways in which this story, even biographically, connects with some of our dilemmas today. And one of those roots goes right through Poole. So after Simulmatics goes bankrupt in 1970, Poole emerges as a leading theorist and really prophet of the internet. He makes a political switch. He becomes a neocon. He supports Richard Nixon in 1972. And he's something of a libertarian with regard to technologies of communication. So he writes a series of books, including Technologies of Freedom, that are really influential on Stuart Brand and other of these kind of Ken Kesey related kind of Fred Turner counterculture, cyberculture people who are trying to imagine, like a John Barlow, like trying to imagine the commercial internet or the open internet. They are all deeply influenced by Poole, who has said, and one of the things that emerges from his experience from Simulmatics, which is brought low by people protesting its immorality and its illegality, right? Poole says, we're building this whole new communications infrastructure. It needs to be utterly deregulated. And that, indeed, of course, is what comes to pass thanks to Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton signing the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which is essentially authored by Gingrich, but which actually has its intellectual origins in the very elaborate writings of Lepore Poole. So there is a really kind of direct line through Poole from Simulmatics and its particular vision to the internet that we have. But there's also this there's another really important connection, which is one of the things that's really interesting about looking at the 1960s is the 1960s was obsessed with us. I mean, if you think about Stanley Kubrick's 1968 film 2001, right? Like here's a vision for the year 2001. Or there's this great Walter Cronkite documentary called The Office in the Year 2000, I think that's made in 1967. There's just, in the late 1960s, people are obsessed with thinking about what the 21st century will look like, because there's an awareness that there's incredible technological change taking place at the same time as there is tremendous political upheaval throughout the 1960s, right? So it's an era not unlike our day, except that there's a lot of like, what will the future bring? So there are a lot of people who are writing like little prophecies. It's the beginning of futurism, like Alvin Toffler and all these people are, futurism is kind of a thing that, Toffler's Future Shock comes out, in 1973. Like there's an obsession with the future and whether it's going to be great or whether it's going to be terrible. And in general, people who've been involved in technological change in the 1960s see, unlike, say, a J.C.R. Licklider, who imagines this kind of universal library of knowledge, a lot of them think there are going to be some very bad knock-on effects of what people, especially who are involved in the ARPANET, are building. So in 1968, Poole, who collaborates extensively with Licklider, who comes to MIT at that time. They undertake a series of projects together. There's actually a great magazine issue, I think it's called Science and Technology, and it's a dual feature of Licklider and Poole. And it's a series of essays about their visions for technologies of the future, computer technologies of the future. And it's just at the moment when computers are moving from being storage devices to communications devices, which is something that is largely lost on the general public. But Poole is among the people who sees that coming. He has been involved at every stage in thinking about the consequences of these emerging technologies. And he's very, very smart. And technologies of communication is his area of expertise. So he, in one of the many essays that he writes around 1968, predicting what the world will be like in 50 years' time, so that would be 2018. He, in fact, contributes an essay to a book called Toward the Year 2018, where like leaders in different technologies are asked to predict what the world will look like in 2018. Everything that Poole says will happen by 2018, in fact, did happen. He's not wrong about really anything. But one of the things, to get back to your question, one of the things that he predicts is that there will be what he calls personal newspapers. When you read the news, you will read the news that is directed to you and to you alone. It'll be custom fit to your political interests, to your consumer choices, to who you are, demographically. And he says like that will create a very atomized electorate, and in fact will destroy the party system. Because a party system involves coalition building, right? It involves people with all kinds of different interests seeing that they share a broad set of political convictions about what change is necessary. That's why it was so stable for so long, that the Republican Party was the party of business and the Democratic Party was the party of labor. It's really about 1968 when Poole is making that prediction that starts to break down. And we move from party politics well into interest group politics and then, down into identity politics, and I think today to some like very hyper-personalized politics. But Poole very much saw that coming, and he saw coming as well a number of other changes that really would not have been predictable by most people. It's his intimacy and with Defense Department work, with what's going on in ARPA, with the incredible research that's going on at MIT. He spends a lot of time at Stanford as well. He is on the ARPANET. He has an email address in 1971. Like he is very much in the know. And it's a rare person at that time who both has the technological sophistication to understand what's going on in the world of hardware and software, but who is also a political theorist, political scientist who can think about political implications. So he's quite a distinctive voice in that way.
And did he have any concerns about this atomization and how it might undermine or affect American democracy? And if not him, do you have any thoughts about social media and its role, if any, in perhaps weakening the common myths that tie us together as a nation?
Yeah, I mean, I think social media has an extraordinary amount to answer for, and what shocks me is that it hasn't been called to account yet. If you think about the other great advances that were put to use to scale in the 20th century, so chemical warfare in the First World War, the atom bomb in the Second World War, biological warfare in the Second World War, out of each of those mass atrocities emerged a moral reckoning, right? So chemists don't engage in the work of chemical warfare. I mean, we have bans on chemical warfare. Physicists shuddered in horror after Hiroshima, renounced what that was. There have not been atom bombs since, we're not dropping atom bombs all the time. They led to an incredible movement of concerned scientists, essentially, of concerned atomic scientists, the Federation of Atomic Scientists, and all kinds of examination of the complicity of physicists in developing weapons that could destroy humanity. The same is true of biologists, right? After the Nuremberg trials, the field of bioethics emerges. So you see kind of similarly with kind of environmental science people who were engaged in work that led to wide-scale pollution, pulling back and contributing to environmental policy making. There just never has been that reckoning for people involved in social media, which arguably has brought more destruction to the world than these other means, right? In terms of destabilizing political community, making people profoundly unhappy, leading to the destruction of the free press in many parts of the world, right? Undermining the business model, the practice of journalism through just kind of a heedlessness around becoming media organizations without giving any thought to what a media organization actually is or does, right? So what distinguishes, though, I would say, chemists and physicists and biologists from people who run social media companies is those chemists and physicists and biologists weren't making billions of dollars a day doing what they were doing, right? They were academics, they were scientists, they were bench scientists at universities. To give up what they were doing was the right thing to do, but it didn't come at a huge personal cost to them. So that's where the absence of activity on the part of the federal government by way of regulation, dismantling monopolies, has caused such a great problem. There's no federal government regulatory check on these companies, and the amount of money people are making off of convincing people to give them their data and selling it to other people who can then destroy institutions of civil society with that data. It's a staggering amount of money.
Just a couple more questions. Do you think that the people at Simulmatics, like Ed Greenfield and so on, do you think they understood the downsides of their technology, of their technology and their work?
There are a couple of moments where people in and around the company kind of hit pause and say, what are we doing? So I will point to three of them because they're illustrative, but I could point to more. One is when Greenfield first is circulating the proposal to do this, he sends it to Newton Minow, who was a partner at Adlai Stevenson's law firm. And Minow will go on to become the chairman of the FCC in the Kennedy administration, quite famously. And Minow reads the proposal and he's shocked. And he writes to Arthur Schlesinger, the Harvard historian, and says, I got to ask you about this. Like, this clearly, like, this should be illegal. It's plainly immoral. And I also think it can't work. And all of those things are true. It should have been illegal. It is plainly immoral. And it also doesn't really entirely work, right? Like, it does not exactly what it says it's going to do. So there's this kind of interesting moment, but Schlesinger, who's a real power broker, writes back and says, Schlesinger thinks of himself as a kingmaker and says, I agree with you on all the moral grounds, but I wouldn't want to stand in the way of science, and maybe it'll work. So it's this kind of like, well, if it's a weapon, we want to be the ones to have it, right? So because politics is in some way an arms race. Another moment is when, after the Simulmatics Corporation takes credit for Kennedy's victory, the Kennedy campaign, it kind of creates a big brouhaha. Newspapers all over the country say, like, this should not be allowed. This is, pretty soon voters won't matter. We're just going to be operated by computers. Like, if our votes can be predicted, why are we even voting? We could just run politics by computers. Like, is this the world we want to be making? Let's, like, carry this down the line and see where this goes. And Poole, who's asked about all these criticisms, because it really is kind of a universal moral outrage about Kennedy having used the services of this company, Poole says, look, I believe that I'm a scientist. I believe in the production and diffusion of knowledge. We have produced a machine that can yield knowledge. It can tell a political candidate information about voters and how they might behave. It can run endless if-then simulations on how voters might behave. That is a useful piece of knowledge, and I have contributed to putting it into the world, and I'm happy about it. The only possible criticism you could give is that it is an unfair advantage for a candidate. So we have built a people machine. But imagine that the opponent of your candidate who has the people machine also has a people machine. And then politics is a battle between two people machines. That's progress. And that's kind of Poole's answer. Like, it's just a question of, as long as everybody has an iPhone in their pocket, no one is disadvantaged. Well, but we're all kind of trapped in our phones. Like, there are problems. So he can't quite see it as a moral problem. He sees it as a resource problem. And then there are many other critiques, but the third critique I want to offer is Eugene Burdick, who's the political theorist from UC Berkeley, who had been asked to work for the company and refuses. The novel he writes is preceded by a foreword written by Burdick, in which he says, I know the people who run this company. This is a work of fiction, but it's based on this company, the Simulmatics Corporation. I know these guys. I've actually worked with some of these guys. They're good people. They have no malign intentions. But I think that they are going to undermine American politics as we know it. And I've written this novel to show how that will happen, how that could happen. And he writes a quite prophetic account of what it would do, by the many ways in which it undermines. It's not exactly what you think. It's not because it works. So, this new report just came out demonstrating that Cambridge Analytica didn't really have much of an effect on the Brexit vote in 2015. It's not, and I doubt that Simulmatics had an effect, right? It's not because it works. It's because it subscribes to an understanding of our system of government that is utterly and profoundly unrelated to our system of government. We do not live in a world in which the people that we elect to Congress, say, are responsible to react to each of us individually at all times and vote in accordance with our collective wishes in a quantitative way. So, for instance, I once interviewed a bunch of people who do data analytics for campaigns, and I said, like, if you could invent the perfect app, we'll call it iVoter, where I'm a member of Congress, I'm about to step into the hall of the House of Representatives to cast a vote on a bill that I think is terrible. I think it's terrible for the country. It may be good for some of my constituents, but on the whole, it is bad for the country. It is even bad for my whole state and bad for my district. But that's my opinion. That's what I'm here to vote, and I want to vote against this bill. But before I step into the hall, I check my iVoter app, and it turns out that my constituents actually want me to vote for the bill. Are you saying, as a data analysis person, that I should vote for the bill because your app tells me that's what the people want right this second? And they kind of all said, yeah, like that's the system we're trying to build. That's actually not how a system of representative government works. Like, I'm not a delegate. If I were a member of Congress, I am not a delegate to my constituents, like a delegate to the Electoral College, which is supposed to do the bidding of the people that delegated you, right? To act on behalf of, by executing the demands of a group of people. A representative is someone who is chosen by the electorate for her good judgment and her talent and capacity to make good decisions in the interest of everybody. So that, for Burdick, who's a political theorist, was like, that's the real danger. Like, this, just the whole idea that, like, voters are users, like that we're pieces of data. This model of thinking about a collective has nothing to do with the republic. It has nothing to, it will undermine the foundations of believing that we cast votes and make choices, both as legislators and as voters, for the public good, in the common interest of all of us, not because we one-to-one respond to, what MSNBC told me to do and now I do it. Like, first of all, you're not going to do exactly what MSNBC wants you to do, because persuasion doesn't work as well as most people think it does. But the fact that you're being told all day long to do something that is only in your interest, that itself, the message about the messaging, undermines our system of government.
Just a final question here for you. What is your greatest concern about American democracy?
I think I have a lot of concerns about American democracy. I think at the moment, we're speaking a couple weeks before the 2020 election. There's a lot of concern. I think that if Biden wins, that Trump won't concede and won't leave office. I think people have that concern. Some people have that concern. My concern is bigger than that, which is that I don't know that we any longer subscribe to the idea that whoever wins, that person leaves office, and the supporters of the loser put their support behind the person in office, right? Like, you get, from the minute Obama was elected, large percentage of Americans just opposing his presidency as a matter of principle, calling for his impeachment before the guy even started doing anything. Obstructionist members of Congress who did not, in some deep way, didn't consider his presidency to be legitimate, didn't in any way contribute toward advancing the work of governing during his administration. I think you could charge, the people who kind of hashtag "not my president" after Trump was elected with that same charge. The kind of immediately there needs to be an explanation for Trump's election that does not involve the choice of the voters. Like, Trump's political opponents pretty much just from the beginning said this is because of Russian meddling, or James Coney, or this is because of some kind of illegitimate interference, right? The collusion argument. Which may or may not, who knows what will emerge historically as evidence is accumulated about the 2016 election, or that, Facebook was responsible, or Cambridge Analytica was responsible. I think that we actually grant far too much power to social media to actually change political outcomes in that way. And we are far too little concerned with the model of human society that it is based on, in which we're only here to exploit one another, rather than to work together to make the world a happier place, a place where more of us can thrive, a place where resources are better distributed, a place where people have a sense of belonging to communities and building communities and strengthening communities. The idea that Facebook goes around saying that its mission is to connect people, it's just one of the greatest bamboozles in American history.
I had one more question for you, Jill, which was, if you had one word of advice for a young person starting out in their career, what would it be?
My word is unsurprising. My word is history. And that is to say that I think, whatever you do in whatever realm of human affairs you dedicate your energies, it's good to figure out what the chief problems in that realm are, and that requires historical investigation, so that you can be sure that the work that you're doing is bringing people forward, rather than in some kind of vague, self-promotional way, making the world a better place. If you want to make the world a better place, you actually have to study world history to begin with.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jill. That was really lovely.
All right.
Thank you.
Good. Thanks.
Jill and Dag, thank you so much for your fascinating, illuminating, and timely conversation. Jill, your one word of history resonates so much with us here at CHM as we focus on the computing past, digital present, and future impact for humanity. So I'd just like to close today's program for all of us by sharing a brief excerpt from Jill's book. She wrote, "The invention of the future has a history, decades old, dilapidated, a time-worn fable, a story of yesterday, because tomorrow is not all that matters." The invention of the future has a history. Thank you, Jill, for powerfully demonstrating this in today's program and in your work. To each of you viewers, on behalf of CHM, thank you for joining this program. Be safe, be well, and remember to vote.